Okay, it's running. Right, first things first. So I'm going to talk through how I made this on Saturday afternoon, and how essentially all the stuff in this is stuff that you already know, that I talked about in week 8, but I'm going to go through it in just a little bit more detail and provide a few more little maybe tips and tricks that you can specifically do when you work from a 3D base. But also lots of little Photoshop-y kind of tips and tricks as well. Because really the 3D base is kind of like, it's like your backbone. It's like the skeleton of the piece. Some bits of the 3D are going to survive relatively unscathed. Other bits of the 3D are going to be essentially completely obliterated and you're not going to see them anymore. But the 3D acts as just that foundation. So you've got something to start with. And so that really brings me on to why it's so important for all of you to lose any kind of hang-ups you've got about 3D. You're not illustrators. You're not fine art illustrators. You're going to be concept artists. So you've got to do stuff as quick as possible. And as I've said before in one of the lectures, one of the ways of doing stuff as quick as possible is to use CG and to use things like photos. Hopefully, maybe you noticed that I was taking and uploading lots and lots of example kind of reference photos over the Easter break. And with the exception of just 2 sort of photos, everything in here comes from the photos I took on my iPhone. So it's just on an iPhone and uploaded to the forums. So I want you to realize how useful and important it's going to be, because otherwise you're going to be spending a lot of time trying to find the right photographic reference for the kind of painting that you want to do. Whereas if you're out and about taking photos with a mind for the fact that they're going to be helpful with your concept environment art, and they can be useful for character work as well, then you're going to be taking those right kind of photos. And the right kind of photos are not pretty photos, not beautiful photos where you're messing around necessarily with cool points of view or angles. They can be quite humdrum, boring kind of photos. Photos taken just from normal eye level, where you want to capture a nice bit of ground, a nice horizon, lots and lots of skies, for crying out loud. So many skies you'll need, and if you have a good library of skies, you'll thank me and you'll thank yourself later down the road. And also things, because at some point you're going to have to be doing human-made kind of stuff. So taking photos of just doorways and windows and walls and all that kind of stuff. Okay, because then you can bring them back later. And if you take them, well, these things like doorways and windows and walls, if you take them flat on, then they're going to be easier to warp into the perspective that you want later. On the other side, if you've done a compositional sketch and you're going to then go out to take some photos for it, then you can take those photos from exactly the right angle, because you've already worked out your composition. So now take them from the right angle and your photos are going to fit easier into that composition that you made. As concept artists, you don't have to worry so much about modeling super neat. In Intro to CGI, yeah, you kind of have to attempt to model super neat, but as a day-to-day concept art kind of 3D, you can kind of throw all that to the wind. You know, you can just model it as quick and as easy as you can do it, right? I got to be careful not of prattling on too much. So I'm going to talk of, first of all, the first step then. Right, so I started off, I didn't even do it on the computer. So again, like I showed you before Easter, just have a sketchbook, have a notepad, have a biro, and just sketch your ideas down. So again, my continued weird obsession with strange, mysterious obelisk artifacts sort of came to mind straight away. So I thought, right, I'm going to do another obelisk-y kind of thing, another sort of thing like that. So I was looking for interesting compositions. So the first one is almost just the idea. A rough attempt at a composition, but it's just getting the idea down. So again, you just do this in, seconds with biro. You just scribble it down. So the next one, looking back at the first one, thinking, well, what do I like? What do I don't like? Well, the idea is okay, but I want to it's just too boring a composition. It's just, there is one flat element there and there is another flat element. They're almost the same size. Even though this obelisk is in the distance, this human figure here is almost the same size of here, and everything's it's just dull, right? So I really want you all to get better at composition, because really, I mean, okay, if you become amazing at freehand painting, then wow, all power to you. But your composition is the thing that's going to make and break your image. And your composition is just how interesting the elements are arranged in the frame. So I gave it another go, moving another obelisk here, and that one further away, but it's still a bit dull. So then I thought, well, I've just got to push it more and more extreme. So I'll have one in the extreme foreground, one kind of in the midground. I'll have my figure now little, although I'm still not particularly happy with plonking him dead center, to be honest, and I'd change that if I was going to do it again. And then I'll have these ginormous things in the far kind of distance. And the rough idea as well would be that the lighting situation of the clouds and the sky will hopefully just sort of draw you to this point. And I'll keep in a little path to show that this obelisk leads up to this one, and I'll try and arrange it all. But again, this isn't like set in stone. This isn't like once you've done this, that's it. Can't deviate from it. This is one of the beauties of using CG. Once you've got this idea down, so getting to this point is like 10 minutes, if that, right? So now fire up Maya and think, right, I'm going to model the elements I need, but because this is a concept art piece, it's not a full CG kind of piece, I can be super rough and I don't have to model in that much detail. So this is what I modeled in Maya. And this is going to be the first of a couple of tips and tricks, maybe, in Maya that you can use. So as you can see, the floor is just a grid that I kind of pushed and pulled the points into shape. I used the soft selection a lot. So soft selection is when you can select an edge, you can select an object, you can select a face, a vertex, or whatever. But if you tap B, it puts you into soft selection mode. And if you hold down B and then increase the middle mouse button, drag the middle mouse button back and forth, you increase that sort of influence. And what this means is that when you select an element and then move it, it kind of falls off. So it's a nice way of very quickly selecting stuff and kind of getting nice, gentle, kind of rolling hills, okay? Things like that. That's your first kind of trick. So that's B. Often as not, actually, loads of you run afoul of B, because at some point you accidentally hit B, don't know what's actually been done, and the problem is B works even, I think, when you're in, you know, sort of, well, actually it's okay in object mode just there. But, oh my god, undo turned off. Who on earth turns undo off? Let me just turn this back on. Where is it? Undo. On. Save. So if you've got B on by mistake, then yeah, you can come a cropper, because you're trying to move one vertex or one edge or one face, and you're moving loads of them. So, as I've mentioned to people who have come across this, if you don't want it, just look to see what colour. If it's yellow or orange or red, then you've accidentally got B switched on, unless you've deliberately put them on. So I modelled the, I just got a grid and I just modelled the rough kind of rolling kind of hill. I made a camera and I positioned it into, again, roughly the right position. And when I'd done that, I just accidentally moved that one actually, didn't I? So I'm just going to move that back just there. When I made that camera, when I sort of got my camera into position, I just went straight into here, create camera from view. So that creates a brand new camera where you're looking out of. I renamed it shot cam, and then I made a bookmark so that if I ever accidentally moved this shot cam, I could just go to bookmark and plop back into position like that. So then I started moving initially just cubes where the obelisks were going to be, and my idea was to try and make an interesting composition by having one close to the foreground, one just here, and to sort of, and I knew there was going to be a path kind of going up. So the idea was this one naturally kind of tilts very slightly here, and it's going to lead you to the midground where an obelisk of the same size, so now you get a sense of scale, and I'm going to have one collapsed on the ground. I'm going to tilt these this way. So the idea is your eye goes from here to here, and then these kind of lead you to whatever's going to be just here. So I just block those out with cubes. when it came to actually modeling them, it was super easy. Let me just show you what I did. So what you can do, again, I didn't want to model any texture or anything like that into it. All I wanted was the rough kind of shape. So I modeled a cube. I made a cube. Let's do something like this. And I just scaled it up. And let me give it a few subdivisions. Oops. Not many, actually, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the smooth command to give me extra subdivisions. Something just like that. So it was very easy with B switched on. Make sure that I'm not... to sort of just pull... whoops. Pull this kind of roughly into the sort of slightly wonky, obelisk-y kind of shape that I wanted. Again, not really worrying too much about any kind of detail, just looking for a kind of nice silhouette, just a nice kind of rough shape. Now when I got to a certain point, I wanted to sort of mess it all up a bit, make it look a bit more rocky, just, again, further break up the silhouette. So what you can do, once you've got the rough shape, is you can smooth it. So you can either hit 3 and then, you know, use modify, convert smooth mesh preview to polygons, or you can directly use the smooth command just here. One thing I would do actually though is I would add a little edge loop down here, just so that when I do smooth it, it still maintains a slight kind of base like that. So hit smooth. Oops, make sure I'm in the right mode. Like this. I'm going to give it 2. Like that. So now it's like this. Now though I want to sort of blobify, well not blobify, I want to add some bumps all over it, but not using any textures. I don't want to go into substance, don't want to do any of that for this. I just want to roughen the whole thing up. Now, weeks and weeks ago we looked at deformers and we looked at non-linear deformers. There's another deformer called the texture deformer. Let's just make sure that this has got some kind of UVs on it. Yeah, it's got some UVs. When you create a primitive object, it comes with some UVs. But again, this is concept art. I'm not worried about laying out the UVs perfectly at all. I just need some kind of UVs on there. So what you can do with a texture deformer is, first of all, you just apply it and nothing happens. But now you've got in here this texture deformer. It's got a couple of settings here. Really the only one you want to be worried about is this direction. By default it'll be set to handle. Just switch it to normal. What this means is it will deform based on the normal of all the little faces. So it will sort of push outwards that way, that way, that way, that way, depending on the angle that the faces are pointing in. If you do it in handle, it pushes all up in the same sort of direction. Here you've got texture, and you've got the little checkerboard that when we're using substance, we apply texture maps to. But instead, what we're going to do is we're going to use one of the other textures in here, because Maya comes with a bunch of its own kind of stuff. These are kind of procedural textures. These are textures that aren't like images. They're not JPEGs or PNGs or anything. They're actual little algorithms that figure out what it's going to look like. And we're going to use Fractal. That straight away happens. You've got in here, you've got a bunch of settings here for Fractal, where you can mess around with this to your heart's content, and that will change the sort of shape and the type of noisy kind of fractal you've got in there. But if we go back up, really the only one I used was the strength. So all the strength does is let you dial in the amount of strength that texture has. So let's put it on there. So you can see it wobbles it up. So I just wanted to put in just a little bit, just like that. So now instead of it being perfectly sort of CG-like, it had some kind of bumpiness to it. And the last thing I wanted to do was cut a chunk out of it. So again, I used Booleans to do this. And normally, in Intro to CGI, I would say use Booleans with caution because they're very messy. But again, concept art, you don't have to worry about it being messy. So I used a pipe, just moved it up, rotated it round. then I made another little one, a bit like a sort of an Egyptian ankh type thing. But I'm just going to do it with just this pipe. And I just intersected it like this. Select the main object, Shift, select the other object, and you can either go up to Mesh and go Booleans, or you can do it using the sort of contextual menu by holding Shift in the viewport and right mouse button and going down to Booleans. And I just did difference, and it cuts that hole out. That's all I wanted. That was good enough. I'm not going to texture it, I'm not going to do anything else to it, I'm not going to bevel it, because again, all the CG is like the backbone for the concept art. Just gets me, you know, in a reasonable place. So I did that. Let's go back to here, and let's go back to the shot cam and make sure that I'm actually looking through there. So I set it up and I put some lights in. Put a direct light, because I kind of wanted it all to be backlit, and I wanted to direct the light sort of roughly where the light source was going to be. I also put a sky dome light in as well, and made the sky dome a very, very sort of pale blue kind of colour to simulate the sky colour, and a really, really low intensity because the sky dome is really powerful, really bright. The direct light, which is one of the few times where I won't go and use an Arnold light, I will use a Maya built-in light, because direct lights are great for just doing kind of sunlights. All they are a direction. It doesn't matter where that light is, all that matters is where it's pointing, its direction. I just kept that at 1 and white, and I went down into the Arnold settings and I lifted up the exposure a bit, and I'd switched this angle up. When this angle's at 0, the shadows from this direct light are going to be infinitely crisp and sharp. If you give it a little bit of a higher number than 0, it's going to start softening those shadows up. It kind of simulates the fact that the light is no longer coming from a single tiny little light point in space. It's coming from an actual radius. And so as a light source, as hopefully you remember from doing the light lecture, as a light source increases in size, the shadows that it casts get softer. So I just put a little bit of that angle in there to give me a slight softness in the shadows. And that's all the lighting was. No other textures. The only other thing I did was I did make an extra material for the ground that I made this kind of muddy green kind of colour. No textures on it, just a straight up colour. I think it's this grass mat. See, that's all it is. I just took down the specular, so the shininess, it's got no shininess. It's just that muddy camo kind of green colour with a weight of 1. The reason I did that is because I wanted the sunlight to hit the ground, and I wanted some of the reflected bounced light that comes back onto these obelisks to sort of pick up some of that grass kind of colour, because I figured that would help the integration of the CG element and the photo element later. So that is another little tip to do if you want to push that sort of, because I would say bounce light is a really, really nice thing to have in all your paintings. Even if you were to paint it manually, bounce light gives a richness and warmth to an image, and it helps further push the forms of the objects in your image. And one way you can kind of exaggerate that when you're doing your 3D base is to make the ground plane a sort of a non-grey colour, so it kind of bounces that colour back onto the objects that sit on it. So there's that as well. Right, almost at the end of the Maya part. So when I rendered this out, I wanted to render it big, so I went down to here and put it as 4096 by 2308, which is going to be the actual end size of the concept art piece. Because again, concept art doesn't often get printed, so it only really needs to be that kind of 4K kind of resolution, sort of really, hovering around that kind of ballpark. So I went in there, made sure I set the resolution to what I want it to be, and also in here, renderable cameras, made sure that it was definitely going to render my shot cam. When you come into here the first time, you'll have 2 cameras. If you've created a shot cam, it'll try and render the shot cam, and it'll also try and render the perspective cam. So I just trashed the perspective cam. So it's only going to render the shot cam. I went into the Arnold Render tab settings, and I bumped the AA settings up here to 6, just so it's just a little bit crisper. So a little bit less graininess in the image. But really, that isn't like a deal breaker. You could keep that as 3 and no one's really going to know. What I did do though is I went down into ray depth and I changed this diffuse number. Now I think by default it's 1. And what that means is that the light is going to bounce once in the scene. In the real world, the light bounces infinitely until it gets so weak you never ever notice it. But by putting this number up a little bit to 3 means it's going to bounce 3 times around the scene. Which, again, is going to, all that bounce light coming down from the ground is going to bounce onto the obelisk, and then it's going to bounce back onto another little bit of the obelisk, and it's going to do that up to 3 times, and then it's going to die. So that's what I did there. And then in AOVs, now this is where it gets a little bit tricky. I've talked about this in the intro to CGI. This object ID pass. If I go to, I'm just going to lower the resolution so it renders a bit quicker. And I open the Arnold Render view. And hopefully Maya won't crash and we'll be fine. Brilliant, it doesn't crash. So a few weeks ago, actually a fair few weeks ago now, I talked about this object ID pass. And the object ID pass looks like that. This is, oh God, if you render out this pass, when you come to do stuff in Photoshop, again, you're not going to be trying to tediously lasso out all of your 3D elements or use the magic wand or the quick selection tool and then, oh, it's not doing it properly or anything like that. By making an object ID pass, you render out this pass for free. It just does it when it renders the main part with these lovely, completely flat colors. So in Photoshop, now you really can just magic wand select these flat colors. You can very, very easily isolate out different parts of your image. You can go back to my YouTube. I think I've put it on YouTube, how to do this. I'll do it again from scratch just to show you. It's not difficult. It's just a bit daunting because you're in these you're in the guts and the engine part of Arnold just here. Let's remove the AOV and recreate it from scratch. So you add custom, you give it a name, object ID, and go create. It creates it just here. Now the only thing you really need to worry about now is this little drop down button here, and you want to go select AOV node, which brings it up here in the attribute editor. Make sure you're in the attribute editor. And then you've got this default shader. So if you click the checkerboard there, go down to Arnold, or I think you can probably search for it as well. You want the, where is it? You want the utility shader, which is just here, actually. And in the utility shader, you change it from color to object ID, and shade mode from n.i to flat. And now when you render it out, you'll get that option just here where it says beauty to look at your object ID, and there you go. You've got these randomized colors. You can get plugins for Maya that make this much fancier where you get to choose exactly what colors and all that kind of stuff. But again, concept artists are, unless you're going for an extremely technical, complicated CG thing, you don't have to worry about that. So you've got beauty and you've got object ID. Now, there is one other special AOV, as they're called, that I created because I wanted a render that only showed me the contribution from the direct light, the sunlight, only, and not the skylight, because I wanted to use that to grab the shadows. And you can make AOVs that have just the sunlight. So you see how all that skylight information is gone. It's just pitch black. You're only seeing the contribution of that direct light. Now the way you make that is, it's fairly easy. It's just you have to just know it. Every single one of these lights, if you scroll down in the attribute editor, down into here, visibility, so it might be hidden. In fact, even if it's hidden, look, even if it's hidden, it shows you it. It's got this thing called AOV light group, and by default, it'll just have the word default written in there. If you write another word in there, another label, it means that when you go to the AOVs, you can add a custom one with the word sunlight after something like direct diffuse. Now, direct diffuse means none of the indirect light, none of the bouncy light, only the direct light, only that first hit of light. But if you put underscore sunlight underneath it, it will give you that result, but for that light only, right? The upshot of it is, it just means you can have a render that shows you only what the individual lights in your scene are doing, which is very useful when you want to capture the shadows and the illumination from just one light. Anyway, right, that's all the Maya stuff. So I rendered it out. There's really only 3 frames. So in Photoshop, we open them up. Right, so I had 3 frames here. So I had the beauty. I had, and then for the rest of them, I'm just going to drag and drop them in here. Had the beauty. We had the direct light from just the sunlight. It looks like that. And then we had that ID pass. Whoops, I've got to say yes to this before it will let me drag it in. Like that. So you've got 3, right? 1. Okay, yep. So this is all you need 3D wise to start working. Right, let me have a look at my notes. Right. Yep, done that. Okay, bring the renders into Photoshop and organize them. Right. I accidentally rendered this with no alpha channel. So at the moment, this is literally black pixels. It isn't transparent pixels. But again, that's easy enough to fix because we got this ID pass and it's perfectly black. So if I'm going to duplicate this first, actually, and I'm going to call this. No, I'm not going to call it anything at the moment. You can be all good and organized and start renaming these. Right. So first things first, magic wand. Select that and that. Ooh, hold down Shift if you haven't got it set up here so you can add to selections. Unhide that again. Go back to here and then just hit delete. So you've got rid of the background. So anything you put behind here will show through, like the sky. But I want to separate out the ground from the obelisks and the debris. So I want to just split them up. Now, you can be super technical and do this in Maya, but let's keep the Maya stuff to a barest possible minimum and focus just on Photoshop instead. So let's select just the ground. I'm going to hold down Shift and make sure I've selected it. So that's a super easy selection of all the ground bits just there. When you've got a selection in Photoshop, you can right mouse button and you've got a bunch of options. And one of the options here is layer via cut. So if you do that, it literally cuts everything in that selection you've got and puts it into a new layer. So like that, you've got the ground separated out from the obelisks, which means I can work on the ground completely separately and not have to worry about it. I'm going to create a temporary layer that sits behind it all. It's just a kind of neutral kind of grey. Now, you might notice that there are some little white lines showing up here. This is, again, all technical. It's the way that Maya handles anti-aliasing. If you're a VFX person, you'd be stressing out about this. But as a concept artist, you don't need to worry because it's going to end up being a 2D piece of art and you're going to paint over it anyway. So you separated out the obelisks. So I'm going to call these obelisks. I'm going to call this one ground. Like that. And I'm going to put the original, I'm going to put the this stuff down here at the bottom. Just like that. And I'm going to select it all and Control G. Unlock that. Control G to just put them into a group. I'm just going to call these renders. Just so I know that that's where they were my original renders and I can close them because I probably won't need to touch these anymore. So I've got the obelisk and the ground separated. So like when you're doing the actual thumbnail compositions, you want to start off from the back and work forwards. So let's start off with the sky. So one of the pictures I took while on holiday in Scotland. Like this. This one I figured that's going to make this useful for so many things. It's got a lovely sky. It's also got some good sort of distant mountains. It's got some water as well. It's got some nice foreground with puddles. There's tons of stuff you could use for this. But obviously it's the wrong it's facing in the wrong way really for the light kind of system, the light direction I've got set up. So the first thing I'm going to do is just control click it to select it all and control T to go into free transform. Right click and flip horizontal like that. And also because it's the sky, I want to put it behind everything. And I'm going to free transform it like this. I'm just going to scale it up. Hide the ground. And I want to get this kind of area here showing up. Something like that. So already, I mean, once you've got sky in, that's like, the sky is one of the most important things. It's going to just key in the mood for the whole kind of piece. But to begin with, I don't want to I'm not worried about the fact that I haven't done any editing to the sky. I haven't painted over it or anything kind of like that. I just want to get stuff in there first and then start trying to work it to how I want it to look like. So the next thing I want to do is I want to create the ground kind of texture. So I took loads and loads of pictures of grounds and stuff, and I really liked this one. Again, for many reasons. I took it from, I've got this kind of scrubby kind of grassland, and I've got loads of stuff in the foreground, and it's going all the way off to the distance. I've got some mountains as well that I could use later. I've got little puddle stream bits. It's just got tons of stuff. It's got cool little rocks that sort of stick out. So there's lots of stuff I can grab from here. So what I'm going to do is just select a portion of this, like that, and I'm going to Control-Shift-I and delete everything else. And this isn't going to cover up the whole, so I'm going to have to actually duplicate this a couple of times to get it to fill up the rest of my ground. So here's a quick way of duplicating stuff. So obviously you can duplicate a layer by clicking and dragging it onto the new layer like that. That will duplicate it. And a quicker way is just holding down Alt as you move the layer. If you do that, you see the icon changes. That duplicates it as well. So I'm going to move this layer over to here, so it fills up a bit more space. Then I'm going to select them both and merge them, Control E, and I'm going to kind of just hide the seam here by just cloning, using the clone brush. I'm going to just selecting just any old brush. Soft brush will do for this. Again, you're going to be painting over this, so you don't have to be precise. So hold down Alt to select a source, and then you can kind of hide this seam like this. That. Now I want to scale the whole thing so that it kind of fits. Also, I'm going to lower the opacity so I can see the ground below. So I'm going to move this up like that. But I want to suggest some of the curve as well. So I'm going to also warp it. So with free transform, you can also distort, but you can also right click and do warp. That allows you to literally sort of bend an image so it kind of fits that sort of rough look of your 3D base. Like this. Right? When you're happy, go like that. Bring it back up to 100%. But of course, you know, there's bits missing and it's not sitting in at all. It looks terrible. Well, we split this stuff up, didn't we? So we had the ground and we had the obelisk separately. So now we can make selections based on these kind of layers. Remember, you can make a selection of a layer by just holding down Control and clicking the little thumbnail, and that will make a selection based on the non-transparent pixels in that layer. So I've made a selection here, but if I go now back up to my ground layer, and with a selection active, if I hit the layer mask, oh, that happens. So now my obelisks are actually now sitting on the ground. Everything kind of matches up. So that's getting there already. Obviously the integration is still terrible. One of the things you want to do as well, whenever you use a photo in your stuff, is have a fiddle with both the curves. So sort of maybe, often as not, bringing it down a little bit will help. It'll bring some of the brightness out of it. And always have a look at the hue as well and the saturation. So if you control U, that brings up the hue and saturation. Just fiddle around with this just to see whether by moving the hue slider it just automatically fits in better. So it's super easy, just mess around with one slider. Always give that a go first. But at the moment, yeah, you know, it still looks like everything's just really sort of, you know, it's not very well integrated at all. But because you've got this on a layer mask, it means you can, and that layer mask, if you hold Alt and click a layer mask, you can see the layer mask. And the layer mask is just black and white. Where it's black, it's not going to show you what's in the layer, and where it's white, it is. So now, if you were to paint into that layer mask with a kind of textured brush, let's choose something that looks a bit grass-like. There are some really good grass brushes in this, with the brushes that I've given you. Let's have a look at this one. I think this is a, well, any brush will do really. But now, if I paint with white, it's going to paint, whoops, I'm painting with black at the moment, hold on. Right, so I want to paint, the grass back in, so I should be painting with white actually. Am I? Oh god, yeah, thank you. Thanks, Ed. Schoolboy error. Right, yeah, so with one of these ones, so if I paint with white, it's going to paint back over the top. And you can kind of do this around the bases of things, just so it looks like some of the photo is going back over the top of your CG to help make your CG sit a little bit better into the image. Right? So that's one thing you can start to do to muck it up a little bit, to stop your CG from feeling too much like it's just sitting totally crisp on there. But also, we want to cast shadows. If we cast shadows, it's going to make an enormous difference. If these obelisks cast shadows onto the photo texture, then that's going to make a huge difference. So how do we do that? Well, there are a number of ways of doing it. We could create a solid color and give it a blue, a kind of slightly desaturated blue, and set it to multiply. And this will darken and tint everything slightly blue. Now, we also want to turn this, we only want this shadows to affect the ground. I don't want it to affect the obelisks. So with the blue layer, this blue solid above the ground, and if I hold down Alt again and I do it in between the two layers, it'll create a clipping mask, which means that this blue solid only affects the ground. So don't have to worry now about the shadows getting double shadows onto the obelisks. But also, I want to create now the shadows only where I want them to be. So, I mean, I could go into this layer mask and I could try and hand kind of paint where the shadows are going to be, or I could use that lighting pass I did. Now, if I hold down Alt and click the eyeball, it kind of isolates one layer. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to use this to create a kind of selection that paints in just the shadows automatically. So I'm going to select the layer, select all and copy it, go into channels, create a new channel and just paste it in there. So I get this black and white version of my lighting pass. Now I'm going to use levels, Control L, to turn this into almost black and white kind of image, just by doing this. Get this very, very crisp black and white kind of image. Like that. Now remember, with channels, just as with layers, you can make selections based on channels by holding Control and clicking the little thumbnail. So now I've got everything white has been selected, everything that's black hasn't been selected, and everything that's kind of grey is semi-selected. So I go back to, if I select the RGB, I go back to layers, hold down Alt and unclick this eyeball to bring everything back again. I want to go into the layer mask of that blue multiply layer that I've made, and I want to fill that. Actually, no, I just want to fill everything with black that I've selected. So I'm going to make sure that I'm selected black. I just took X, just quickly switch between black and white when you're in layer mask mode. So I want to fill everything with black. So I hold down Alt and backspace. So now where it's black, it hasn't put the blue. Where it's white, it's left the blue. If I deselect it, now I've got the shadows from my 3D casting shadows onto the photo textured grass. So now the 3D and the photos are beginning to feel more connected. Just a quick note on the clipping mask. So a clipping mask, when you've got this little arrow, means that anything you do here only affects the layer below it that isn't a clipping mask. And you can stack up these clipping masks. You have loads and loads of layers. Think of it maybe more as in, this is the parent layer, and all the layers directly above it with the little clipping mask are the children layers. And they'll only affect their parent. They won't affect the stuff further down below it. So clipping masks are very useful. So this at the moment, I can call this shadows. This clipping mask is now creating the shadows for me onto the ground. And because it's a solid, I can just double click this at any time and I can change the colour. I can have green shadows if I want. I can have red shadows. I hope that if you haven't been doing this already, you can see how quick that's going to be to mess around with shadow kind of colour. With a lot of this kind of stuff as well, you always want to take down the opacity just a bit. If you leave it at 100%, it can sometimes just be a bit too strong. And again, because you're applying this using a layer mask, you can roughen up those shadows. Because again, at the moment, we're casting pretty sharp shadows over rough, scraggly kind of grass. So if we took a textured brush and we changed to a white kind of colour in the layer mask, we could go into here. Actually, no, the opposite. We could eat into this to make it look like, you know, that haziness of the grass, you know, like the shadows are basically falling on lots and lots of strands of grass instead of just a smooth, flat kind of surface. You see how that works? So you do lots of that. Do that all over the place. Like that. Another thing. So at the moment, we've got perfectly crisp, sharp edge, and you know we've got a grass texture, so that doesn't really look particularly realistic. So if we go into the layer below, our sort of grass layer, we can add to the layer mask again, just as we did with the shadows. So we can actually add some bits to it. So you can find yourself a nice grass brush and just do it slightly over that horizon line. Just break up the edge. Now, you might need to add more of the texture. So you'll also need to go into here, into your actual colour part of the layer, maybe select, colour select, hold Alt, and paint into there as well. So that way you can roughen up the horizon line and make it look all natural. Makes it all nice and grassy. Now, I'm going to stop here and then now kind of more rapidly walk through the layers one by one to show what I did. Otherwise, I mean, as I said, it took about 4.5 hours to sort of do this, and obviously there's no way I could do all that in time, right? So I'll just talk roughly through what's happening, some of the key bits in here. Let's have a look. What can we look at? So let's turn that off. That off. And let's look at the texture on the stone. Okay, so again, I used a clipping mask on the obelisk layer of a piece of stone. I think I've got it here, actually. I can show you. This is one of the few ones that I did go online, and I just looked up and just found some stone. Any old stone at all, right? Made that a clipping mask to the obelisk layer, so it was only going to show up where the obelisks were. Scaled it up, rotated it, free transformed it, and set its transfer mode to overlay. Overlay and soft light work really nicely as textured kind of modes. If you've got a roughly grayscale kind of photo and you use overlay, it'll really only affect the texture rather than the colour. It can still be nice and useful if you do have colour in your texture, because it can just also provide you with subtle shifts of kind of colour. So I just stacked up a few different of these stone kind of layers to put texture onto my obelisk. Another thing you can notice here as well, by the way, is that my obelisk now have a rougher kind of edge. Again, in week 8 I said, you know, you can just trace over the edge of your CG with a textured brush. That'll just instantly break up the that too crisp CG kind of look. Or, you know, if you've got a layer mask, you could apply it to the layer mask instead. So that way you're not committing yourself to that look. You can always, you know, erase bits of it and bring back more of the sort of textured edge. What else have we got here? Also added a bit of contrast to the obelisk. Again, all I did was go into the freehand lasso and go in here, making this kind of scraggly kind of line like this. Made a layer mask of that with a curves adjustment layer, so that the curves would only affect that one side. Because I just thought it was looking a little bit flat. I was losing some of the form, so I just want to add in a little bit of extra kind of darkness on here, just to push that form a little bit more. Then I wanted to add, of course, the cool glowing kind of runes carved into it. So again, just using the freehand lasso, I traced out that rough kind of shape in the CG, and then painted, using a nice textured brush, some blue colour into it. And I set that to color dodge mode, so it bloomed, it glowed a little bit. Then I duplicated the same layer that I'd just done, blurred it, Gaussian blurred it, and linear dodged it, so it kind of had that little glowy halo kind of happening as well. And then I also just wanted to put a little runes in here. I could have gone more overboard. I was looking online for just kind of runes, sort of Scandinavian kind of Viking kind of runes and stuff like that. Made them black and white, and then I could make a selection of them, and then again just scribble into that selection the same kind of bluish, kind of glowy kind of colour. So that was how I did the stones. I did a lot more work. I could have done a lot more work actually still on the ground. To make the path on the ground, I did what again I'm always banging on about, is I used the freehand selection and looked for natural parts in the texture that was already there on the ground to kind of trace out a kind of path kind of shape like this. And then using a brush, I just directly colour picked and started with large brush strokes, just painting into that selection to kind of define the path. And then choosing darker colours to sort of go around just on the edges of the path, just to blend it in a little bit more. I also dabbed all over my image with a kind of a brushy, grassy kind of brush as well, that I was colour sampling just to hopefully break up some of the photographic nature of the texture I was using. Again, I did it quick. You know, ideally I'd spent ages doing this, so I'd sort of get rid of that photo-y kind of look of it, but still have all the base colours and information that the photo gives you. Another tip on the sky, actually. Yeah, the sky. That's a good one to talk about. So, the sky. So there was the sky originally. The Smudge Tool. If you want to stylize a photo, the Smudge Tool can be really useful. So if you go to the Smudge Tool and you choose a nice brush, let's get on something like the ground, I suppose. Something like this. You can nicely just kind of smudge in a direction with a textured brush and get rid of some of that overly photographic kind of look. And that's what I did with the sky to begin with. I smudged it all out. And then on top of it, I added another bit of sky that I found, of kind of like a storm kind of brewing. And I put that to linear dodge, and I kind of cut it out with a layer mask. So it was only going to show up there, just to further push that glowing kind of light source. And then I applied some levels to it to further intensify it. And then I shifted it with a hue shift to kind of match it into that kind of blue magic kind of thing I was going for. Again, these are all on this clipping layer, so these are only affecting the sky. And then finally on the sky, well actually not finally on the sky, I applied a sort of a vignette to darken it all off. Again, always thinking about the composition to bring it towards here. And all the vignette was curves with a gradient just put in there. And then finally on top of it, the whole thing, I took a nice cloud brush and started colour picking and just pushing little details of the sky. Again, these little glowing bits of light peeking through, everything trying to continually point back towards this kind of focal point. So that was the sky. What else can we talk about here? Yeah, we'll talk about, just to wrap up briefly, I had this bloke here that I found, just cut him out and position him just there. He's got a little layer mask on him, and I just kind of layer masked out his feet just so it roughly looked like he was sitting in the grass. Again, ideally you would go in there and you'd use the hue shift and curves to kind of just mess around with the values to bring his colours and values more in line to the actual image you've got already. He's too dark. The blacks here are too black here. So that could do with improvement. But what helped here a lot, this is also a very, very important thing. Where your horizon meets the sky, you want to add atmospheric haze. And again, all that is just a layer with a soft kind of airbrush. I pick the colour of sort of the horizon line part of the sky and softly dab over the horizon, just to sort of tie it in. I did create a little temporary little selection around here to further separate out this obelisk from that obelisk just here. So that's really useful. You can use these color lookups. So color lookup is down here. Color lookup. What's color lookup? If you haven't used it before, color lookup is a bit like an Instagram filter. It kind of simulates, but it's like a grown-up Instagram filter. It kind of simulates the different film stock. So it takes your image and then it goes, what if your image was shot on Kodak 5205 Fuji 3510 film? What would it look like? Would it look like that? Now, it serves two kind of functions. One, it can pull your colours towards a certain pleasing inbuilt kind of colour palette. But kind of more importantly, because it's doing this cleverly to the shadows, the midtones and the highlights, it also helps unify all these separate elements together a little bit. It just ties them in a bit better and adds a little bit of contrast, which is super nice as well. Then I did my thing where I like to bring in just like some stone kind of texture or concrete and apply that over the top in soft light. And that just gives it a bit of bite, you know, a little bit more extra sort of texture, but fairly low down, you know, on its opacity. Then I did a Control-Shift-E, so I did a copy all visible, so I could have the whole thing, so I wouldn't have to flatten it, but I did have the whole image now in one go, because now I wanted to sort of now paint on top of it. I wanted to use the whole thing as a base, and now add in my spooky mega obelisks in the far distance. And again, this was done just making selections with large textured brushes and choosing values that are behind, so it looks like it's coming out of the actual kind of environment. And by using a combination of brushes on their own and selections, I get like the hard edges, but then I also get these little like nice textured brushy kind of edges. And to do the next one in here, all I did was copied the layer and flipped it and scaled it and moved it back and knocked it back a little bit further. That's another thing to do and remember. If you create something nice that's going to be repeated, don't just try and redraw it from scratch. You're working digitally, you might as well take advantage of it, make a selection of it and copy it, and it makes it look like you were perfect at managing to draw the same object but, you know, reversed and in the distance. And I had a layer mask for that, so I didn't have to worry about going over the edges of anything like that, so I could just freely and easily just paint in those. And then on top of everything, another curves layer. Now this curves layer adds contrast, but it also messes around with the color, because with curves, if you do The RGB just gives you the levels, but you can go in here and you can individually mess around with the red, green, and blue. And if you draw like S-curves and inverted S-curves and you mess around, again, it's a bit like you're making your own Instagram filter. But you've just got more control over where it's going to be. So looking at this, if I was going to go back and I was going to do more to this, a couple of things really bug me about this. I should definitely spend more time on the ground paintifying it. Because then, again, when you get to this point, when you say you merge it, you can now go in and you can just paint over the top with a lot more freehand, painterly kind of abandon, because you've done all that hard work. All the stuff on top now is just going to be like all the stuff that's going to make it look nicer and nicer and nicer. So I would go in and I would definitely work on getting rid of the photographic look of this ground and making it look more painterly. And I just hate the positioning of this guy. Even though everything points towards the centre, he just feels a bit... I don't like the fact that he's just dead in the centre of the screen. I always tell you lot not to put stuff in the centre of the screen, and I'm just as guilty of it as well. So I'd move him to a different kind of position. Actually, this is another thing. I would take a photo of myself in the position I want it to be. That's another thing you should definitely do. Just start, if you put characters in your environments, because an environment with no characters at all doesn't tend to tell much of a story, but if you put a character in there, it tells some kind of story and creates some drama. And easiest way to do that character is to just take a photo of yourself in the position that you need to be in. There's no point sweating hours trying to paint, oh God, freehand paint a realistic character when all that character's real purpose is to simply add some scale and add some drama. And it is an environment piece, so just take a photo of yourself and put it in there instead. This is what working professionals do. This is something that I've been looking at a lot of the work of John Sweeney, one of the key concept artists at Naughty Dog, and he just takes photos of himself. If he needs like some dude with a gun hiding behind a corner, he just gets out a plastic toy gun and hides around the corner and takes a photo of himself, and there you go, he's done it. So I want to always get back to for me, the important things about concept art, whether it's character or environment, is how fast you can do it. And so to do it fast, you've got to use all the shortcuts and cheats possible. And composition and drama. You're not interior decorators, you're not architects, so don't position things in your images like, here is a castle, here is a man, here is a goblin, here is a dragon, here is the sun. Think about where you're putting the camera, so you've got big things, small things. It's like I was talking about right at the beginning of the semester, look for big, medium and small shapes. I got a few of them here. I've got these big forms and I've got little bits of detail here. I've got little clusters of rocks, but then I'm also with the composition trying to constantly lead you to where I want you to look and not over clutter it. Looking at all of your stuff before Easter and in semester one as well, everyone's got a tendency to chuck too much stuff into their image. Rein it back. You can make it super simple. If you're just going to have one castle, or you're going to have one cave, or it's going to be one spaceship or one space station, you can totally do that if you find that interesting composition. And to find the interesting composition, think about where you put the camera and how you arrange your objects around. When you first draw it, this is where you're planning this kind of stuff, because you can do it so quick and so easy. And then if you take it into CG, if you take it into Maya, you can further mess around with it. To be honest, also get ready for this as well. Often as not, you'll do your best stuff in this stage, and it'll only ever get worse. I think this is actually a better composition than that ended up being. I think I wimped out and didn't make this obelisk as big as it should have been. But, there you go. That's another thing. Your value studies sometimes will look prettier, even though you're not meaning for them to look prettier than your final piece. But that's something you've just got to get used to. So think, composition, speed. You don't have to do super modeling. You just got to do enough to get you to that point where you can continue to work on it, right? So if I could do this in 4.5 hours, then you should be able to do something. Ideally, I want you to be doing this kind of stuff for the beginning of next academic year, so we can all start from this point and then work on to way more interesting, more fun kind of stuff to do, where we get more adventurous. Okay, that was quite long, wasn't it? So I will put this up on YouTube, and I'm going to make it available straight away, because otherwise Thursday's lot have to wait ages to see it, and you know, time is of the essence now, I suppose, and Friday's lot as well. So okay, and you can just obviously continue working with your project and ask me any questions. I'll be more than happy to help. I've probably missed stuff, guaranteed to have missed stuff, but never mind. Okay, thank you.